British computer expert accused of hacking US defence systems is told he can be extradited, despite fears his mental health puts his life at risk.
It is not fair or just that a boy who's got mental health issues can be taken away from his family, who are his support network.
Good evening. Larry Love is accused of hacking defence systems, the FBI and US Central Bank. If found guilty, he could be jailed for 99 years. But he and experts say his life is at risk in America because of his mental health. Today, a judge rejected that, but it's down to the Home Secretary to make the final decision. Mr Love tells us tonight why she should spare him. Also tonight, UKIP elects Diane James as its new leader. Can she escape the political grip of Nigel Farage? For the murder in Rochdale of a Muslim imam and healer in an ISIS-inspired attack, a 21-year-old man has been sentenced to life. And trying to get aid into Aleppo in a fragile Syrian ceasefire that's already being violated. A British judge has ruled that an autistic man from Suffolk can be extradited to America to stand trial for allegedly hacking into US government computers. Lawyers for 31-year-old Larry Love, who has Asperger's syndrome, say he faces almost a century in prison if found guilty. In an emotional appearance outside court, Mr Love said he would appeal. We'll hear from him in a moment. But first, our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, reports.
Some supporters of Larry Love made their point noisily outside Westminster Magistrates' Court. Others took a rather more traditional approach before he went in, like many, confident the whole thing would be over. It didn't happen.
It may simply be that this is so important that it has to be settled at a higher court, and so we shouldn't look upon this as even nearly the end, but it's just a point in a longer process, and we'll continue to fight because we're doing what's right.
The case will now be appealed to the High Court.
We're incredibly disappointed. We thought that we'd done enough. Only the defence called evidence. The prosecution didn't actually call any evidence at all. The judgment itself is pages and pages of the defence case, and then concludes by saying, I'm going to send the case to the Secretary of State, which effectively means that she's ordering extradition.
But the US insists he must stand trial there. They say he hacked into FBI, Central Bank and Missile Defense Agency computer systems. Mr Love has Asperger's, a form of autism, and his supporters say he couldn't function in a prison on remand for several years before even facing trial in America, and should stand trial here. His father, prison chaplain Alexander Love, said once again his son's predicament shows the UK-US extradition treaty is a one-way street.
If I was a Baptist minister in America and my son had Asperger's and they were trying to extradite him to Britain, I'm pretty certain my son wouldn't be taken away from America. But here, you know, it's going to happen.
Gary McKinnon's mother, Janice Sharp, was in court today. Her son faced similar extradition.
In America, no American who commits a crime while they're physically on American soil can or would be extradited. Why then do we extradite our own?
In the end, with great publicity, Gary McKinnon was not sent for trial in the US. And why? Because the then Home Secretary intervened to stop it. And who was that? Theresa May.
Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Larry Love and I asked him whether he did hack into US computers.
So what I'm hoping is that when the extradition prospect is removed, then I'll be charged here in the UK and I'll see some evidence, if there is evidence against me, and I'll be able to formulate a defence then.
So you're not prepared to say anything now because it would incriminate you?
Unfortunately, I've been in the state of legal limbo for 3 years, and we can expect there to be a criminal prosecution in the UK, and the normal way for the rule of law to proceed is you get charges, you see the evidence and you formulate a defence with your legal representatives. I'm fighting for the right to have that.
Now, the judge in the ruling says that although there is a risk to your mental health, they are satisfied that the American prison and health system will be able to deal with this. Why do you think that's wrong?
Well, it's disappointing because we had 3 days of hearing in which several experts on conditions in the US prison system spoke at length about how it would be inadequate for the mental health problems that I face and the vulnerability that I would be at. And because my parents work in the prison system in the UK, I know quite well the differences. We are much more humane and caring.
Now, if the Home Secretary goes ahead and rubber stamps this ruling, I presume you will appeal.
Yeah, so we have...
Is it your intention to keep appealing this right to the end?
Sure. We have to keep fighting because I don't really entertain any prospects of surviving if I enter the US justice system, so we will take it to the next court. We'll hope to win there.
I mean, some people would argue that what you are being accused of is much more serious than what Gary McKinnon was being accused of, because you're accused of actually working with other people to deliberately hack very serious computer systems in the United States. And that's a different circumstance to Gary McKinnon.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is we don't want to preempt the process of the law, and so the seriousness and the gravity and the context will be treated in a UK court of justice, and a jury and a judge will decide.
And are you prepared to take the consequences of whatever your actions demand?
And
you know, if you've broken the law
certainly,
to a very serious degree, you're prepared to go to jail, or you just want to go to jail in Britain?
I just think that the UK justice system should be independent and sovereign, and we have functional courts and we have functional prisons, and if there is a case to be answered, I will answer it, and if there is a debt to society to repay, I'll repay it.
If the Home Secretary is watching you, what do you want her to understand about your case?
It's important for her to make her decision bearing in mind the qualities that we cherish as a nation, and to prevent what might be a tragic result, and to demonstrate that there is a duty of care that's still exercised towards the citizens of this country, and that we won't send them away to a fate that they might not ever return from.
Larry Love. Now, Diane James has been elected the new leader of UKIP with almost half the votes. In her first speech as leader, she called on the government to invoke Article 50, the formal process for Britain to start leaving the European Union by Christmas. But she has a job on her hands to unite a warring party, which today saw another high-profile defection to the Conservatives. Our political correspondent, Michael Crick, is in Bournemouth.
Well, today was meant to be a day of celebrating the Brexit vote with speeches from leaders old and new. Instead, it was dominated by defections and infighting, particularly with UKIP in Wales, where there are rival leaders, including the former Tory MP, Neil Hamilton. UKIP claim they won the referendum, yet this conference follows weeks of internal backbiting, and now the defection to the Tories of two senior figures, including a very close friend of Nigel Farage. Mr Farage, what do you make of Alexandra Phillips defecting? Bad day for you, isn't it?
I think she was treated quite badly.
By whom?
It's a bit. I think some of the elements in UKIP Wales need a bit of dealing with, but you know, that's life.
Neil Hamilton.
Well, he wasn't necessarily my first choice, was he?
I mean, it's not a good day. Farage had sent Alex Phillips to Wales during the general election after mysteriously removing her as head of media.
Turkey ranks 149th.
But this year she was still entrusted to present UKIP TV broadcasts. Today, though, she quit.
The atmosphere within the party is hugely toxic. There are so many different factions, it's like a spirograph of Venn diagrams.
Conference this morning was dominated by the old leader's triumphal farewell speech, a time for UKIP to crow.
We did it! We got our country back!
It wasn't Farage at his classic best, but he did try to give his party new purpose over Brexit.
We can be very proud of the fact that we won the war, but we now must win the peace. And the only mechanism to put pressure on the government to keep the debate live and to make sure that those 17.4 million people get what they voted for is for UKIP to be healthy and for UKIP to be strong.
After lunch, a new leader was announced.
With 8,451 votes, the leader of the UK Independence Party, Diane James.
A member of the European Parliament, James was backed by most of the party bigwigs.
What's your reaction? How do you feel about it?
But she refused during this contest to do any debates with her opponents. Today, she issued this challenge to Labour and Tories.
And if you're watching TV this afternoon, you'll be watching the opposition party in waiting. And Mrs May, from one grammar school girl to another, stop the faff, stop the fudge, and the farce. Get on with it. Invoke Article 50.
And within minutes, we learned she'd axed all 4 of her leadership opponents from the conference schedule for later today. And tomorrow, Neil Hamilton, UKIP leader in the Welsh Assembly. How did you get to hear about this?
I didn't. I was just handed a leaflet by somebody from UKIP in Wales.
So that's how you were removed from the agenda, is by handing you a leaflet?
Well, that's how I found out I was removed from the agenda.
Diane James insists it's the leader's right to remove speakers as they wish.
It's my prerogative, and I chose to change the programme.
Why? A purge?
No, not a purge. Michael,
Nigel Farage, of course, had a big reputation for purges, and many in this party doubt whether Diane James can be anything like as effective as he was.
Well, as UKIP ushered in a new leader and faced a defection to the Conservatives, and Labour seemed poised to re-elect Jeremy Corbyn, the former Chancellor, George Osborne, made his first big public appearance since his departure from government. He said, unlike David Cameron, that he's going to stay in Parliament and fight for what he called the liberal mainstream majority. But where is the centre now in British politics? With me now, the Times columnist Philip Collins, the Labour and Momentum activist Barbara Toomey, and from the UKIP conference in Bournemouth, Neil Hamilton, who is, of course, also a former Conservative. Neil Hamilton, you've been biffed from the conference programme. Are you the first purge victim of Diane James?
Well, I've only been taken off the conference agenda. I've certainly not been purged. I'm the leader of the UKIP group in the Assembly, elected by my colleagues. The problem with Nathan Gill is that he wasn't, and he can't cope with that. I don't know whether today's decision has something to do with this. But there it is. You know, life goes on.
Are you a fan of Diane James?
I always got on with her very well. You know, I've been in the party 10 years longer than she has. I canvassed for her in the Eastleigh by-election in 2012. I've always had very cordial relations in the past.
Why doesn't she like you then?
Well, I haven't been told that she doesn't like me. She may just feel that the conference is a bit too exciting and it needs a sedative, so she's brought Nathan Gill on instead.
OK, well, stay there for a second, because Philip Collins, I mean, what we see is UKIP and the Conservatives now sort of, you know, merging almost in policy terms over Europe and grammar schools. We see Labour, you know, virtually about to re-elect Jeremy Corbyn. What is the liberal mainstream majority? What is this centre ground? Does it exist anymore?
Yeah, it always exists. I'm not sure it'd be right to call it the liberal centre ground. I think that might be misleading. But the Conservative Party would reject the way you characterise them. I mean, they may well be veering to the right, but they don't mean to do so. Theresa May's speech on social mobility was not an attempt to shift to the right, even if that's the effect. And I think that there is a sort of there's a sort of sweet spot in politics, which is if you are thought to be the party which is the party of economic competence, and a party which at the same time looks as though you care about social justice, then you're going to win. And the party which is closest to that formula will always win. At the moment, the Conservative Party, even though they're quite a long way from there, are still the closest to it. And that's why 15 months ago, David Cameron won an overall majority. So it's not changed that much. I mean, George Osborne was the strategist who delivered an overall majority only 15 months ago.
Barbara Toomey, this sort of centre ground isn't where you and the Labour Party membership want to be anymore, is it?
I mean, I don't think that any one party can claim the centre ground. I mean, from the data from 2015, only a third of Conservative voters will class themselves as social liberal, and 60% of Labour voters will. So I disagree that there's a shift for a Conservative or the UKIP off the centre. I think the issue is loads of people's living standards have been driven back, and that's the most thing they care about. 0 hours contracts on the rise, people don't have secure employment. You've seen the cuts of benefits for some of the most vulnerable in the country, and that's the reason why we've seen hundreds and thousands of people who've never been involved in politics before join the Labour Party. So in many cases, I think the Labour Party is winning people in the centre because people are fed up on sitting on the fence and stuff. They actually want action.
Well, unfortunately, there's just no evidence that this is the case. I mean, the Labour Party is not converting people who voted Conservative the last
last election. It really isn't. It's confirming its core vote. It simply isn't making any progress. It hasn't made any progress at all since the last election. And in order to do so, you have to win over people who previously voted Conservative.
But why have both parties, the Labour and the Conservative parties, the two biggest parties, got rid of their centrist leadership in Cameron and the new Labour leadership?
Well, for the Conservative Party, it's obviously a huge convulsion over the European Union, which complicates the fact that it's not liberal, because obviously 52% of the country voted to leave the European Union. But they, nevertheless, Theresa May would not describe herself as taking the Conservative Party to the right.
Neil Hamilton, I mean, you chose to sort of leave the more centrist Conservative Party and go to UKIP politics. I mean, why do you feel that that's where you can win? Is the centre ground just kind of a nonsense now?
Well, I think these terms left, right and centre don't really mean anything anymore. Politics is much more fractured than it was when I started out 50-odd years ago. I've been fighting the battle over the EU since 1967, and I've seen the Conservative Party change many times in between. UKIP now is able to bridge the class divide in a way that the Tories can't. The biggest votes for Brexit in Wales were in Labour heartland seats like Merthyr and Ebbw Vale. Labour have abandoned the territory of their traditional supporters, and UKIP is going to pitch very heavily for the votes of these traditional Labour voters who have been abandoned by their own party.
But, I mean, do you think, when Diane James says you're going to be the official opposition and you've got one MP, you're going to be waiting a long time, aren't you?
Yeah, but in the Welsh Assembly, we've got 6 members out of 60 altogether. Labour doesn't have a majority on its own. We have the balance of power in our hands, and we're playing a major role inside the Assembly. The Assembly will get more powers as a result of Brexit and the Wales Bill currently going through Parliament, including tax-raising powers. We are already an opposition party in Wales. We're not in waiting. We're actually out there battling day in and day out and stamping our presence on the face of politics in Wales.
Barbara and Toomey, I mean, there is a similarity almost between what you hear from the right and from the Labour Party membership now, which is that this sort of, the mainstream is like a dirty word to you, isn't it?
I don't think it's a dirty word. I think that there's a narrative, right? There's what people think is really going on in politics, and there's what's actually going on. And then there's the third thing, which is people's lived experience and what they're being told is the problem. And when people from poor communities are being told that migrants are the reason why they don't have jobs or have to the NHS, and that's something that they believe, then that becomes part of the narrative. So actually, Labour is doing a long-term strategy, a long-term task of getting people to understand what's happening with their reality, what's happening to their lives right now, what's happening to their job prospects, what's happening to their education. That's the long-term strategy we are taking.
And Phil, you think neither of these people are going to win until they rediscover the centre?
There's no chance whatsoever of winning. I mean, the idea that UKIP will be the opposition is a fantasy, and the idea that Labour can go from the position that Jeremy Corbyn strikes to victory is absolutely ludicrous.
No, it's not.
It's completely preposterous.
It's
I mean, the
not.
first rule of politics is can you count? And there just aren't enough people in Britain who agree with you. You might be right.
Well, we're going to win them over,
but
but you missed the whole point. We have a long time to the general election. I did not wake up one day and became elected. There were things that I went through to become that, and there were things that were explained to me, and that's the long-term strategy.
No.
We want to explain to people that actually Jeremy Corbyn, as the Prime Minister, is going to raise living standards, and that's what we're doing. We've managed to do very well so far.
We will all wait and watch.
Oh, it will go very well.
Thank you all very much indeed for coming in. Now, a 21-year-old man has been sentenced to life in prison for his part in the murder of an imam in an ISIS-inspired attack. Mohammed Saidi was the getaway driver for another man who battered to death Jalal Uddin, who had been targeted because he practiced a form of spiritual healing considered to be black magic by some extremists. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel reports.
The victim was stalked for months around Rochdale. His ISIS-inspired killers monitored the Muslim scholar on their mobile phones. They despised 72-year-old Jalal Uddin for his traditional beliefs. To them, his practices violated their extremist views. Specifically, the wearing of an amulet known as the taweez, which is said to ward off bad spirits and bring good luck.
I would describe it as an act of terrorism, where people are using violence to scare and to try to defeat somebody's religious practices.
The so-called act of terror took place on the 18th of February this year. Mr. Uddin was followed to a friend's house. The court heard a car driven by Mohammed Saidi with his alleged accomplice Mohammed Qadir drove round the streets waiting for their target to emerge. And when he did, Qadir got out, followed the elderly man to a children's playground, and bludgeoned him to death with a hammer. 3 days later, as police gathered evidence, Qadir, a former John Lewis call centre worker, fled to Istanbul. Counter-terrorism officers believe he may have crossed into Syria and joined ISIS. But Saidi was convicted today of murder by a unanimous verdict. The jury had been shown a photo of him in Rochdale with an ISIS flag draped over a road sign which had been altered to read War Zone. Another had him holding up an ISIS flag outside a mosque, and another with him wearing a stab-proof vest. 3 years ago, Saidi, the court was told, had been on a medical aid convoy to Syria, and it was then he was radicalized by ISIS propaganda. His hatred of Jalal ud-Din took shape on his return. He and others, the jury heard, first plotted to have the former imam deported, but abandoned the plan. They described him as Voldemort. After Saidi was arrested, police found footage on his mobile phone of Mr. ud-Din dying in the playground.
There are new reports of fighting across Syria as opposition forces and the government accuse each other of violating the ceasefire. The biggest test is in Aleppo, where 40 trucks of aid are seeking to enter the besieged city. Access for humanitarian assistance is a crucial part of the US-Russia peace deal, but as Porrick O'Brien reports, it's become a stalemate.
In Aleppo, when is a ceasefire a ceasefire? And when is it not? It's day 4 of the Russian-US brokered deal, and at best you can only really talk in terms of less bloodshed rather than breakthrough. One Syrian human rights group says it's recorded over 60 violations. That still represents something close to stalemate, though, rather than full-on hostilities resumed. All eyes on the regime-controlled Costello Road, an access point to the rebel-held east of Aleppo, part of the terms of the ceasefire that aid would be allowed in. At the moment, a convoy of trucks which were en route are stuck, waiting for permission from the regime to drive into Aleppo. If they make it, it will point to progress.
The first 40 trucks, as we heard yesterday, are loaded with food for some 80,000 people for a month. And we really, really want to get it to eastern Aleppo. So, as I say, it's highly frustrating. We know the world is watching.
This small stretch of road tells us a lot about this complicated conflict. As part of the ceasefire deal, both rebels and regime forces were supposed to withdraw from Costello. Initially, the Russians said Syrian forces were doing just that, complete with satellite imagery. But then said they'd come back because US-sponsored rebel groups weren't keeping their side of the bargain.
We're ready to extend the ceasefire for another 72 hours. We're expecting decisive action from the Americans to influence armed groups under their control. Otherwise, the situation in Syria could get out of control.
The US in turn said Russia should pressure Assad to issue the permits that would allow the aid convoy to pass. Aside from superpowers trading accusations, activists on the ground in East Aleppo see the arrival of aid along regime-controlled corridors as paving the way to a prolonged siege.
We're just afraid that it will happen here, what happened in other places. When they started they were first besieged, then they started receiving aid, then the world forgot about them, and then they had to surrender and leave their homes.
Getting an aid convoy down Costello Road then, a fraught affair. And it, just one part of the ceasefire deal.
Some breaking news from Syria. The Pentagon says a senior Islamic State figure has been killed by coalition forces in a US-led airstrike. The attack, which took place last Wednesday in Raqqa, killed the Islamic State's Minister of Information, Wael Adil Hassan. The Republican US presidential contender Donald Trump has publicly accepted that President Obama was born in the United States. Hillary Clinton said Mr. Trump's overdue acknowledgement of Obama's birthplace doesn't go far enough. David Smith has clinched Britain's 51st gold medal at the Paralympics in Rio after winning the boccia mixed individual BC1 final. Earlier, Britain's Paul Blake won his first gold in the T36 400 metres to take the tally to 50 gold medals. More of that in a moment. Until tomorrow, that's Channel 4 News. Bye-bye.